Well, back to this Sunday now, and Jonathan Miller comes to the penultimate programme in his series, States of Mind.
It's very hard to identify the name of Hitler with anything apart from ruin, cruelty and misery. But I think we can thank him for one indirect and rather unexpected result of his policy of intolerance, repression and murder. Throughout the 1930s, a flood of intellectual refugees found safety in Britain and in the United States. And in doing so, they transplanted some of the most interesting ideas in 20th century thought. Along with art history and physics, of course, psychoanalysis has prospered in exile. But in the case of psychoanalysis, prosperity has brought schism and revision. And as with Karl Marx, the theory which was founded by Freud has undergone elaborate modification. In fact, it's now reached the point where the various schools will hardly speak to one another. And although, of course, they acknowledge the same intellectual ancestor, it's not always easy to recognize their affinities. Well, in England, the figure of Melanie Klein has loomed larger than most. And one of her most eloquent exponents is Dr. Hanna Segal, who is a practicing analyst. And apart from other things, she's a world authority on the early mental life of the infant.
Well, if we start with the broad statement that the human mind, that the adult human mind is an achievement rather than an endowment, I wonder if I could start by asking you what the Kleinian and the post-Kleinian position is with regard to the development of the human mind and how you see this perspective of human development.
Yes, maybe I'll start by saying something about what this word Kleinian means,
Yes.
because there are many confusions and misconceptions about it. Sometimes people oppose Kleinian to Freudian and think that it's something anti-Freudian or non-Freudian. I think maybe it's important to remember that Kleinian analysis, certainly in the mind of Mrs. Klein and her followers, is very much a Freudian analysis, extension of the Freudian analysis, a development rather than an opposition. It derives more from the later Freud than from the early Freud. Now, the way I would put it is that Freud made us acquainted with the child within the adult, and particularly the child on the couch. And that Melanie Klein, who analyzed children, got us acquainted with the infant in the child and in the adult. Now, Freud certainly did have theories about infancy, some of them extremely illuminating, but they were theories. He didn't really work with the infant on the couch.
So Freud's idea about the infant was, as it were, inferred retrospectively from the material which came up from adults during the process of analysis, rather than from direct acquaintance with the child.
Yes, but I think it's a little different because on the couch, we also infer about infants. We don't analyze infants. Only obviously analyzing a child, maybe it's easier to observe the infant within the child than directly in the adult. What happens is when Melanie Klein started analyzing children, let's say age 2¾ was the youngest patient, she realized that those children had already long psychic history and a complex internal world. For instance, at the Oedipus complex, which was supposed to start at 3 or 4, she had evidences of very violent Oedipal conflict in very much younger infants. And of course, when you speak of the mind as an achievement, those first 2 years of life, what I call the infant within the child, within the adults, are of fundamental importance, because it is within those first 2 years that we develop thinking, symbolization, capacity to play, talking. That is, we really develop the mental apparatus, the basis of it. And according to Melanie Klein, it is in those first years that we lay certain basic patterns of object relationships, and that in fact the development of thinking, symbolization, speech are not autonomous ego functions, but are in fact a function of developing object relationships in the infant's life.
Now, what do you mean exactly by an object relationship, and what exactly is going on in the formation of an object relationship?
Of an object relationship. I think that Freud thought of an object as the object of instincts. Every instinct has its object. Let's say the breast would be the object of the instinct.
Of feeding.
Of feeding.
Yes, I see.
Our genitals will be objects of instincts. Bit difficult with the death instinct, of course, which has no object. I think that Melanie Klein never formulated it like that. The way I formulated that with the Kleinian analysis, object became much more an object of the infant than an object of the instinct, which doesn't mean that it's not an object of instinctual strivings as well, but probably a great deal more enters into it. It's an object of perceptions. It's also an object of emotional communication. For instance, now, even from infant observation, we are aware how enormously responsive infants are to the change of mood of their mothers. So that's not directly. If the breast was only an object of an instinct, then the mother's mood would be irrelevant.
So in that first, say, 18 months of life, how is the mind visualized by the Kleinians and the post-Kleinians? What's going on?
What's going on?
And how is it becoming furnished?
Yes, right. Of course, it's not a question that one can answer very shortly, and therefore what I am going to tell you will sound terribly schematic. And being very schematic, it will seem less real and plausible than it would be, I hope, if I could develop it over hours and show the clinical material. But one could put it that way, that when the infant is first born, it is assailed by a medley of perceptions, and we think also assailed by its own desires. Because one point I think that Mrs. Klein very much took from Freud is that from the beginning there is a conflict between what we could broadly call a life and death instinct, but I could put it, let's say, more clinically, that the infant reacts to this medley of perceptions either by grabbing at life, as it were, or by wanting to annihilate this awful change that happened to him. To me, the death instinct is not wanting to go to the inorganic, but just to do away with the pain of living, one could say, with this sudden change. So the infant is born into a sort of chaos of contradictory perceptions, pleasant and unpleasant, contradictory desires, and he very soon starts to sort them out. And the sorting out, which we call splitting, is a term which Freud applies to later phases of development, but which Melanie Klein applied to these earlier phases, is the infant tries to make sense of this medley, and the way he makes sense of it is by attributing everything that is desirable to something which we call the breast. But the breast is a very psychosomatic complex concept. It's not just the physical breast, but to an experience coming from an object that satisfies hunger, takes away the cold, makes one feel totally happy, maybe brings back even some feeling of being back in the womb, and attributes both his experiences to a bad object. At that point, you see, there is no perception of absence, for instance, of a good object. One is assailed by bad things, or one experiences something very ideal.
So the good things are all that is promising and flourishing and nourishing.
And nourishing, yes, and which is later becomes, as it were, conceptualized as the breast. When the analysts speak of the early infant as the breast, he doesn't mean that the infant actually has an anatomic sort of perception of the breast in the first few days, but the thing that then becomes the breast. So, from the beginning, there is an active process in the mind which we call splitting, and in which the desire then is to incorporate into oneself this good thing and make it part of oneself and to push out everything that is bad. In fact, something that Freud, in his essay on negation, said the first move, as it were, is this I'll take in, this I'll spit out. The examples, I think, are not far to seek, because you could think only of normal adults who make one nation bad, so other nation good, one race bad, so other nation good. I'll give you a clinical vignette of that from an adult and from a child, and I'll come back to them from a slightly different angle. One is of a patient who was very apt to function in a paranoid way, as we would call it, seeing things white and black. She heard that there was a party given by a Swiss analyst who had a beautiful castle in beautiful mountains, and she heard that there was marvelous food at this party. And she dreamt that she was about to enter a balcony, but she didn't know which, because there were two balconies. One was in full light, in sunshine, and had lovely food on. The other one was black and filled her with a sense of apprehension. And her association was that somebody told her, this is the balcony from which Dr. S used to throw his patients down the precipice when he was fed up with them. But it was a sort of very clear representation, not knowing which breast she was going to meet. Unfortunately, it would be nice, it would be so simple. It isn't so simple, because it isn't only that there is this relation to the ideal and the persecutory object, and we are all familiar that for a very young baby it's bliss or disaster are a second away, but it is also compounded by what we call projection, or what later in Kleinian analysis become projective identification. That is, that this bad breast is not only the bad experience which is inflicted by the environment, but that the infant who wants to get rid of all sorts of bad internal feelings deal with them by projecting them outside. Therefore, this bad object acquires the characteristic of the part of the self, one's own bad impulses or parts of the self which one wants to get rid of. And here I'll come back to my two ladies, because another dream this patient said, which this patient had, which was a day or two after, was a dream that she was lying on the couch, feeding a complete baby. She was greedily eating her way into me. She was feeling it quite physically, feeling in a blissful situation, and then something came like two enormous spiders that started pulling her away. Now, she connected it with the end of the session. She had some spider phobia, but she also connected to hands. And obviously her experience of mother's hands taking her away from the breast was that the hands had the characteristic of all her own greed, because she was eating her way so greedily into me, and then those hands came and were so greedily really devouring her.
I see. So if I can recapitulate just for a moment then, so that there are two sources of bad feelings. There are the bad feelings which arise from unpromising and unpleasant experiences which arise in the outside world. And those are, as it were, emblematically represented as a bad breast.
Yes.
And then there are feelings which are uncontrollable desires or impulses which arise from within, which seem to threaten the personality because they seem to burst out from inside and therefore have to be projected into the outside world. If I got it right.
But they're not different, it is the same. You see, what happens, let's say, in the situation in, call it, reality to this patient is a frustration. It is a bad thing, but it is experience in terms of her projection. You see, hunger gnaws you. In other words, hunger is not felt at that primitive level as the absence of a good thing or a frustration. It is felt as something gnawing you. In other words, you attribute to the bad experience the characteristics of that part of yourself which had been projected.
Well, now, once the infant has segregated the world into these two alternatives, and it's, in a sense, rather a Manichaean view of the world with everything good, everything bad, something which is promising and something which is denying, how does it actually handle its further development? One would have thought that this, in fact...
that would be it. Maybe I introduce a technical term because those are terms bandied about that not always understood. That phase of the development when the infant copes with this chaos by producing the ideal object related also to the loving self and the bad object which is then hated, Mrs. Klein called the paranoid schizoid position, not meaning that all infants are mad, but meaning that this is a phase of development which becomes probably the fixation point of paranoid schizoid phenomena, either paranoid schizoid illness, which is already what Abraham posited, that this is a fixation point of the psychosis lying in that area.
So by fixation point you mean that although this stage of development is not in itself pathological, it would be pathological if that was the stage to which the adult reverted.
Reverted to.
Yes,
so the adult never reverts to sort of unaltered early things, but also this is the phase in which if the things go wrong,
I see. So that if the adult reverts
sort of islets of illness which can be activated and which influence the later development.
So you call that phase the paranoid schizoid phase because it would be a paranoid and schizoid type of illness where the adult to revert
to function in
those terms.
In those terms.
I see.
Now the way things proceed in a happy development, let's say, goes something like that. And it depends on external and internal factors. That since the child internalizes, introjects this ideal breast and identifies with it, in that way the infant's early ego gets strengthened.
Now, if I can pause again. You say that it internalizes what is good in the outside world.
What is good in the outside world. And in internalizing, we see in these introjections not only one of the early roots of the superego, but also in that the infant, as it were, is nourished by it, identifies with what it gets. The infant becomes stronger. As it becomes stronger, it is less driven to project outside bad things, because if it projects, if it feels stronger, it feels less threatened, it can tolerate better his inner things, therefore he projects them less, therefore the bad breast becomes less bad.
I see. So that by incorporating an image or an emblem of what is promising and nourishing
nourishing
in the outside
the
world, and by incorporating it into his mind, or into her mind, he's better placed to accommodate the bad feelings that he might have.
To accommodate the bad feelings.
I see.
Therefore he's less driven to attribute it all the time to an external object, and therefore this picture of this horrible external object becomes much less horrible, and in that way the two become more closer together. It's more of a, could call it a reality perception of what the object is really like. A number of things become integrated, partly through the physiological development of the infant, but partly through this emotional development which I described, which if it doesn't happen, even the physiological things get retarded, and gradually the infant becomes aware of something that Mrs. Klein calls the mother as a whole object. That is, he becomes aware, is less related sort of egocentrically to bits of mother that give satisfaction or persecution. He becomes more able to perceive his mother, let's say, as a person who comes and goes, who is the source of gratification but also the source of frustration, that she is not two people but she's one, and she is not an object solely related to the infant, but somebody who comes and goes. The concept of absence comes in. The concept of mother as a person who has a life of her own. And simultaneously with that integration, the infant, through withdrawing his projections, becomes more aware that it is he himself who loves and who hates, and who loves and who hates the same object. And this brings in a different, as it were, register of feelings from the ideal and persecutory, because in becoming aware of the aggression to a loved person, the beginning of ambivalence brings in such feeling as guilt, rather than pure persecution by the bad object, such feelings as fear of loss of the object, such feelings as missing the object, which were named depressive position. That is again maybe a psychiatric reference,
yes.
Except less so, because after all, being capable of feeling depressed when your loved object goes away is recognized as a very normal feeling. It isn't normal not to be able to feel sad or longing or capable of having feelings of guilt.
So this depressive phase, once again, like the paranoid and schizoid phase, is only so called because if the adult were, as a result of some illness, to revert to that infantile stage, it would be illness.
It would be illness.
Yes,
because it's also a matter of degree, because we must be capable of depressive feelings, which is not the same thing as a depressive illness. I would say that if we think of the depressive position, when the infant feels that in his omnipotent destructiveness he had annihilated his object, external and internal, and is left in a state of a sort of totally destroyed internal world, that would correspond to a depressive illness.
So then, if I read you right here, if all goes well in the process of development, the child, the infant, having passed through this stage of splitting and of seeing the world in terms of good and bad, promising and the reverse, then proceeds to a stage in which it is capable of identifying the mother as a whole person who can be there or not there, but whose absences are not seen as annihilating threats.
That's right.
And am I right also in saying that in reaching this stage, the infant is learning to recognize and identify with the forces of conscience which is simply another name for the
Yes,
superego, presumably.
yes.
And that these are to some extent identified with the mother, who is now seen as a whole
Yes.
object.
Yes, and the father, I left the father out of it, but in this phase, I think it's also very important that since the infant recognizes, as it were, independent people who lead lives of their own, the father enters in an extremely important way. You know, that is where Mrs. Klein disagreed with Freud about the timing. No, for Freud, I think father really appears somewhere at 3-4 years. In Mrs. Klein's view, what she names a depressive possession already begins to include
I see.
father and the parental couple.
Now, in arriving at these stages, if one sees these as milestones of emotional progress and development, what is it that determines the outcome? Are these stages delayed or frustrated by events in the outside world, or by the vicissitudes of the internal life over which we have no control, after all?
Yes, I think that this is one of those endless discussions which to me are fruitless, because attributing a single view to either opponent is attributed to them a ridiculous view. For instance, if one were to think that Winnicott, let's say, or Bowlby or Balint really thinks that the infant is tabula rasa, that all infants are identical and only the external events impinging change them, it would be attributing to them a ridiculous view. Now, some people attribute to Mrs. Klein the totally ridiculous view that everything is internal and the external world doesn't matter. You know, that an infant that would be abandoned by parents and brought up by the orphanage is just the same as an infant that's lovingly reared. So either extreme is ridiculous, but certainly if one looks at the proportion of the one or the other, there are people who tend to attribute more to the external and people who attribute more to the internal. Now, I think Mrs. Klein and I myself attribute a great deal of importance to the internal factor, to how a given infant deals with the situation.
Well, I think the reason why I ask it is that I'm sure that many members of the audience must be very concerned in bringing up their children, to know that if the emphasis lies upon the accidents and the unexpected events of the outside world, they are going to feel that they ought to, as parents, have much greater control over the environments within which their children are reared, because they can, in fact, powerfully determine the mental health of their children when they finally become adults. But if the outcome is genuinely determined by internal idiosyncrasies of the individual, then, in that sense, the parent is impotent over the outcome. And I think that it becomes an issue for parents.
I think
of a very urgent
that
sort.
parents should take responsibility for their children and have a say. There is absolutely no doubt about it. And that, well, if you take it, let's say, on the level of the paranoid schizoid position, obviously the infant who will get the good breast very frequently and very well will have a greater chance of building up, as it were, the strengths of the ideal component as against the persecutory component, as against the infant that will be frustrated.
But then arises the purely practical issue of if a mother, for reasons which have nothing to do with her, happens to have a child that is in fact ferocious in its attacking of the breast, and seems to be an incoordinated child, although she herself has generous and graceful feelings about her own body, nevertheless is frustrated as a mother. What then happens in that relationship? How can she actually accommodate that?
With difficulty.
I see, yes.
That is the only thing one can say, that some mothers do have very difficult infants. And of course the projective identification, the projection I spoke about, it's not only an infant's fantasy. Infants have a way of inducing uncomfortable states of mind in mothers. I can see you smiling as a father. The same goes for fathers. And it is very important how mothers can deal with those feelings of discomfort that the infant produces. This is an area of work which Wilfred Byrne worked in very importantly when he speaks of the mother capable of containing the infant's projective identifications. That is, not a mother who is not anxious and blocks it. Now, some of the self-idealizing mothers, she can cope with everything in the child, nor collapsing or becoming hostile, but a mother who can respond, one could almost say, with an appropriate anxiety to the infant's distress, who can tolerate bad feelings put into her without losing her composure. But of course with some infants it's very, very difficult because they can induce states of real panic or distress.
So in all of this, one begins to see that fantasy plays a very large part in the development of the mind. Now, I wonder if you could outline the role that fantasy and fantasy building plays in the development of the mind.
As I'll use maybe a formulation that Susan Isaacs gave to fantasy as a mental representative of instincts. In that the infant in his mind early on is omnipotent, whatever he wishes is. Freud spoke of the early hallucinatory wish fulfillment. So that the infant lives in a world of omnipotence is the same to say as in a world of fantasy, that his wishes are accompanied by the fantasy of a satisfying object. And this goes not only for his libidinal wishes, which was at the time Freud of hallucinatory wish fulfillment, he thought of libidinal wishes, but also of destructive wishes, which are stirred by frustration or by envy.
So that these, excuse me, these fantasies then, which the child, well, I won't say enjoys, but experiences, are the fantasies of a satisfaction which the world won't or can't provide, or fantasies of destruction which the child visualizes the world actually being destroyed by...
and destroying him. That would be the very early ones. Now, when the infant does get actual satisfaction, there is a merging and a correction, because there is always a bit of, as it were, discrepancy between this ideal breast and the breast that actually comes to feed. So even in the ideal feeding situation, there is some correction by reality which makes it a bit more ideal, again a bit more excessive. And when we think of mental health, I think it's the infant's capacity to tolerate those discrepancies, which are tremendously important for the mental development. And a very fundamental change happens in fantasy with the depressive position, not only that the content of the fantasy changes from this ideal and persecutory and fragmented, which we didn't talk about, but which is important, to more integrated and more to what oneself has done to objects, but also a differentiation happens or increases, since I said right from the beginning there are those discrepancies the infant has to adapt to. But for me the depressive position is very much the battleground of what Freud described as the reality principle overcoming the pleasure-pain principle. Of course, I say in the depressive position, I don't mean it happens at 6 months. In fact, I had to fight that battle out with a man of 74 before I completed his analysis. But those are, as it were, two modes of functioning. And as the depressive mode of functioning takes over, part of it is the differentiation of fantasy from reality, and that, of course, has a fundamental relevance to thinking, not confusing one's thought with concrete object, to symbolization, and this whole area of mental functioning. See, the early modes of functioning with projective identification gives rise to what I call symbolic equations.
And what are these exactly?
What are these exactly is that what to a normal person would be the symbol of something, to the person who thinks concretely is the thing. The example I give in one of my papers is of two patients, one schizophrenic who was a great violinist when a youngster, and I asked him, why don't you play your violin? He said, I won't masturbate in public. So for him, playing the violin was an act of masturbation, and his arm was the penis or whatever. I had simultaneously another patient who played the violin, and for him too, playing the violin represented a masturbation fantasy, and for him too, the violin had various symbolic meaning. But even in his unconscious, not just in his consciousness, those were symbols of object functions he's given up and symbolically represented through a depressive process.
I see.
That symbolization is like a completion of the process of mourning. The object is given up and symbolized in other ways, whilst my schizophrenic never gave up certain things and concretely wanting to find the penis, let's say, in the violin.
And couldn't actually distinguish between the two?
Couldn't distinguish between the two, equated the two.
I see. So that there is then, therefore, what one would call a pathological process of symbolization in which the patient actually equates some part of the body, say the penis, with something like a violin, and actually can't see them in a symbolic relationship, but sees them as an identity.
As an identity. And that links with not being able to differentiate fantasy from reality.
I see. Well, now, then am I right in saying that what happens to the fantasy life as the child encounters the real world and with all the vicissitudes of experience is that reality becomes accommodated to in some way, and the element of fantasy therefore shrinks or withdraws its frontiers as the creature or the organism or the person learns to recognize what is self and what is
the object,
and what is the object, what is non-self.
But I don't think fantasy life shrinks. I think it's a bit different. You know, the old idea of the scientist was that the scientist is rational. He puts his fantasy life away, he observes reality. Now that isn't true. We know that the scientist comes with hypotheses in his mind, conscious or pre-conscious or even unconscious, which he tests. To me, reality principle doesn't mean we put our fantasies away. Now we're rational human beings. It's more complicated than that. I think our fantasy life goes on, but it's repressed, it's symbolized, and it is constantly tested. It's our fantasy is like a hypothesis of what the world is like, which is constantly being retested. Shall I say a word about mother's body? One of the very important papers of Mrs. Klein is on the symbol formation and its relationship to the growth of the ego. The infant has an enormous wish to explore and know mother's body and what could be called the epistemophilic instinct. It can be linked with love or it can be linked with destructiveness, but I think it's an urge of its own. Now, exploring mother's body with this complex feeling, of course, gives rise to enormous anxiety. Therefore, the child displaces it and symbolizes it in the world, and it gives rise to the interest of everything in the world. Now, without the symbolization, I think that things which are not endowed with symbolic meaning at some level probably don't interest us. That it is because the external world is endowed with symbolic meaning as well as whatever it is, that is of such enormous interest. Of course, it might interest us for survival. You know, we would still need food or shelter or something. But our whole interest, I would think, the epistemophilic interest, the creative interest in the external reality, it's because we endow it with symbolic meaning of all the things that the infant wanted to find out and achieve in relation to its primary objects.
So are you saying then that that apart from those purely expedient relationships which we have with the outside world, where the cognitive capacities obviously have survival value, that the purely intellectual interests which we display as human beings, our scientific curiosity, for example, or our interests in art, are fundamentally modeled on the symbolic relationships which we first learn in our attitude to our mother's bodies.
To our mother's bodies and ourselves, because there is also the search for oneself and one's maybe psychic realities.
But nevertheless, our curiosity in what we think of as simply our intellectual pursuits are ultimately modeled on a world of libidinal feelings towards objects which are in the outside world.
Yes.
I think that a lot of scientists would find it very hard to accept the idea that so many of their curiosities, which seem to them to spring simply from a direct and concrete interest in the way the world is, would have to come from something as
primitive
and as personal as that. Could it not be postulated as an alternative that if we, for our survival, need to have cognitive relationships with the outside world, that science could just as well spring from an overdevelopment of the cognitive capacities which we acquire as creatures which need to survive in a difficult world as much as our relationships to our mother?
Well, the having to survive comes also in the relationship to mother, and that is carried over. I'm very doubtful of those scientists making discoveries for those pragmatic reasons. I mean, such scientists as I worked with were animated much more by what you call curiosity, not by the pragmatic, say, need to survive.
But in all of this, then, the role of symbolism is an indispensable process for actually undertaking relationships with the outside world. And you're saying, are you, that in the absence of the capacity to form symbols, the mind actually becomes stunted? And
well, you get that in the autistic child. That was the paper of Mrs. Klein which brought it more to so much to the fore, was an autistic child. The autistic child doesn't play, doesn't talk, can't relate to the external world, doesn't have a cognitive interest in the world. That little boy was interested in two things which enabled his analysis to start, because he was a non-speaking child: door handles and trains. A tiny bit of something that survived and still symbolized an interest. Actually, the train had to do with a parental intercourse, I think, and the door handle with entering mother's body. And it was through following that tiny thread that in the analysis one could discover all the interest in his mother's body, which in his case was blocked because of being too sadistic and too projective, too concretely identified with mother's body. And as soon as that started being liberated, he started displacing and getting interest in all sorts of things, a cognitive interest, the moment things started symbolizing.
Now, in all this, if we can begin to summarize and wind up a little bit, I think the first question that occurs to me is really how one determines validity of interpretation in this field, confronted by dream material or by the material of free association and so forth. How, in fact, does the analyst actually distinguish between what would be a valid interpretation of a particular lot of material and an invalid one? Obviously, it's not like the process of the concrete verification that goes on in natural science.
Yeah, it would take us to concrete thinking if we started treating our patients' associations as something that has to be weighed or measured in that kind of way. I think that you'd ask maybe the most important question, not only for Kleinian analysis, but psychoanalysis in general, because I think psychoanalysis tends to being a science rather than completely being a science, because so much still depends on our intuitive faculties and so on, but that the criteria that we have to develop for validation must be different in many areas than the validation of physical facts. We're dealing with psychic reality and psychic life. Now, I would take for myself as a validation of an interpretation something that I would feel as a move towards integration in the patient's inner world. If I think that something that was felt by him to be a piece of the outside world is becoming experienced by him as his own feeling or fantasy, that would be one point. The other point maybe would link with it if I felt that the interpretation did put the patient more in touch with a reality sense. But here I have to say what I mean by reality sense. The reality sense doesn't mean you suddenly become realistic and give up your life. In some countries you think analysis is a success, the patient became realistic, he made a lot more money. I have often seen this as a very bad result of the analysis. It's only when those people go to another analyst and they stop being so rich they improve. This is a view of reality sense, you know, so long as you get on, Jack, and make your pile. I'm exaggerating. But what I mean by the reality sense is being aware of one's own inner reality, which is one's wishes, one's fantasies, even one's misperception, and capable of testing it with external reality, so that the sense of the, I think really of perception as a reality sense, the capacity to relate one's fantasy to the real world and see which is which. One can see it as it were in long term, but in short term, what I watch is mostly moves to integration, and that also means usually a change in relationship to me as the interpreter.
So that his or her attitude to you must be one of the signs of the validity of the interpretation which you've supplied.
To me and to the interpretation itself.
I see.
Yeah. That the moves that the patient makes towards more, call it realistic, though it's a misleading term, relationship to me and to the interpretation and to his internal world.
And then presumably then in relationship to you, that you would test the validity of the interpretation because the patient ceased to project onto you all sorts of hostile fantasies, for example.
Or ideal fantasies.
Or indeed
maybe,
ideal ones, yes. And saw you as Dr. Segal.
Yes, and could acknowledge, let's say, his own feelings. It's not always a loving response. It could be the patient gets in touch with the fact that he's in fact very angry with me for what I have done. Not only mothers, but also analysts give cause for anger, sometimes by acting rightly, like the parents who give cause for anger by setting limits, let's say, but very often by acting wrongly. Patient could be angry by previous interpretation being wrong.
But nevertheless, the test, really, in other words, of the validity of the interpretation is that you, the analyst, dwindle to your own proportions and to your right size as another human being, rather than being a huge, either exorbitantly promising or exorbitantly threatening fantasy.
That and the patient getting in touch with the reality of what he thought.
Yes.
Because the patients may think they see you as right size, and then you have to make them aware that in fact they do see him, you, as ideal or the monstrous or something. They have to acknowledge that, the psychic reality, and simultaneously realize that they had this fantasy and yet see you as your right size. What I mean is that the validation is more complicated than that. It's not just the patient seeing you as you are, but the patient, it's more the integration thing, the patient being aware of both what is and what he feels about it.
I see. So
Which
that he
makes-
sees, in addition to you, he has seen for the first time the unrealism
Yeah.
of his or
Yeah.
her previous attitudes to you.
Yeah, that he must see that, let's say, though he saw me as a very nice person, in fact his behavior to me, let's say, was motivated by a fantasy that I'll rob him of all his money or of his thoughts or interfere with his sexual life. And then when he becomes aware of this unconscious fantasy, he can become aware also that it isn't so.
Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Next week, at the same time, in the last of the series, Jonathan Miller will be looking at the book The Manufacture of Madness and the Myth of Mental Illness.